Robinson Crusoe, Cast Away, and for some years now, 7 vs. Wild. Have you ever imagined what it would be like to be stranded on a desert island? If you had to take on nature single-handedly and throw yourself into a thrilling adventure? Well, perhaps you should remember that reality is much crueler than what you see on the screen. In 1761, a blood-curdling incident occurred in the Indian Ocean that nipped any thoughts of an exciting venture and the volleyball Wilson in the bud. At the time, a desperate crowd of people found themselves on a tiny island, hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest landmass and completely on their own. The stranded people faced an uncertain future, but some of them actually managed to defy the relentless nature and hold out in their sandy grave for 15 years. But how on earth was this even possible? What led to this traumatic catastrophe? And above all, why was the group of people deliberately left to die? There are not many reasons to attract visitors to the tropical island of Tromelin. With a size of less than 1 square kilometer, the tranquil island is located about 440 kilometers from Madagascar and 580 kilometers from La Réunion, or in other words, it is somewhere in the middle of nowhere. When the French ship La Diane first came across the tiny landmass in 1722, navigator Jean-Marie Briand christened it Île de Sable, the Sand Island. And for good reason. Apart from a few low shrubs, Tromelin has only one thing to offer: sand in vast quantities. At the same time, the windswept island is extremely flat. Its highest point is just 7 meters above the barren landscape. With a lack of drinking water, food, and shelter, Tromelin is not exactly what you would call a life-friendly paradise. At first glance, it seems that anyone who finds themselves in this floating wasteland is doomed to certain death. Because let's be honest, how long could you last in these harsh conditions? A week? A month? Or 15 years? If we turn the wheel of time back to July 31st, 1761, we end up on the night when the Util is caught in a devastating storm, runs aground on a coral reef off Tromelin, and finally splinters to pieces. Originally, the Three-Master, which had been converted into a slave ship, was on its way to the Île-de-France, which we now know as Mauritius. In the run-up to the voyage, the crew had bought dozens of slaves in Madagascar, but of the at least 150 slaves on board, at least 70 were to drown during the sinking. Many of them didn't even have a chance to escape the sinking ship. The hatches were locked, and some had even been nailed shut. 20 sailors had also found a watery grave, but the survivors, 122 whites and 88 slaves, eventually saved themselves on the sandy bottom of Tromelin. The castaways had quickly explored the small island, finding mainly sand and coral deposits. According to reports, the sparse vegetation consisted only of a few grasses and shrubs, and there was also no trace of drinking water. As a result, more than 20 people died of thirst in the first few days after the disaster. The white crew salvaged what they could from the ship, erected tents with the sails, and hoarded the scarce food and water supplies without giving any to the slaves. However, the essential supplies were soon used up, and the sailors were forced to dig a well to at least ensure a supply of salty, brackish water. In the end, this also benefited the slaves, and there were at least a few seabirds, hermit crabs, and shield crabs on Tromelin to satisfy the hunger of the stranded people. But after 2 months, the white sailors left the shadeless island for Mauritius. They had built a raft from the salvaged wreckage of the ship. Before they left, however, they promised the slaves that they would send them help, and indeed, after their successful crossing to Mauritius, they tried to keep their promise. But there was one man who thwarted this plan. The slaves were deliberately left to die. When the French governor heard the story of the survivors and looked at the emaciated faces of the men, he did not hesitate, and immediately said that he would not save the slaves. On the one hand, France was at war with England at the time, and an attack from India was expected. In this tense situation, such an elaborate rescue operation simply did not seem appropriate. Furthermore, rescuing the slaves was simply too expensive for the governor. He stubbornly stuck to his decision, which is why there is even said to have been a public uproar. Over time, however, the people left behind on the distant island fell further and further into oblivion. From then on, nobody seemed to be interested in what happened to the slaves. It was not until 15 years later, in November 1776, that the ship La Dauphine, under the command of Chevalier de Tromelin, docked off the Coral Island to pick up any survivors. However, the sailors found only 7 women and an 8-month-old baby. The remaining slaves had lost the fight for survival, and yet it was nothing short of a miracle that anyone was still alive after all these years. The man who later gave the island its name, Chevalier de Tromelin, was amazed to discover that the inhabitants had woven clothes from seabird feathers. What's more, they had somehow managed to keep a fire going for 15 years, even though fierce trade winds and hurricanes regularly whipped across the island. This fact becomes even more astonishing when we consider that there was not a single tree on the island, and firewood was therefore in absolutely short supply. De Tromelin also learned that 2 other rafts had set sail in the course of time, but their crews were never seen again. As most of the timber had been used to build the rafts, the islanders had to resort to other materials in their fight for survival. For example, the slaves had built huts out of coral and sandstone to protect themselves from the fierce winds. They also built a lookout on the highest point of the island. They did not want to miss the ship that had been promised to rescue them. In detail, however, the islanders violated an old Malagasy custom with their choice of material, which stated that stone buildings are reserved exclusively for graves. But who can blame the people in their time of need? In the end, de Tromelin took the remaining survivors to Mauritius, where the baby and his family came under the care of the new governor Jacques Maillard. He also declared the slaves free and offered to take them back to Madagascar, but they refused. Maillard decided to baptize the child Jacques Moise and rename his mother Ava. Her Malagasy name was Semiavu. The governor named the child's grandmother Dauphine after the ship that had rescued the survivors. How did the stranded people survive for so long? To this day, historians are still puzzled as to how the people were able to hold out on the island for 15 years. What is certain is that English sailors visited the island in 1830 and found stone houses and graves there. Spurred on by this report, a research group led by Max Guéraud decided a few years ago to investigate Tromelin archaeologically and reconstruct the slaves' struggle for survival as well as possible. Due to the strong winds and treacherous sea currents, however, the underwater specialists were hardly ever used. However, they did manage to identify the remains of the Udall in the sea. The archaeologists' search for evidence on land proved even more successful. At the highest point of the island, they uncovered the foundations of a building, but it seems that Tromelin's largest house once stood exactly where the French had built a meteorological research station in the 1950s. Elsewhere, the researchers uncovered the remains of an oven, shards of glass, copper and ceramic crockery, as well as metal shoe and belt buckles. The bones of birds, fish, and turtles were still found not far from a former fireplace. In combination with the shells of mussels and snails discovered, the diet of the stranded people could therefore be traced quite accurately. The bottom line is that the finds to date and the surviving reports do not give the impression that the people were crushed by their situation on Tromelin. For although the situation appeared hopeless at first glance, they tried to survive in a very orderly and methodical manner. During the next expedition, the archaeologists discovered further building remains and numerous objects, including 2 lighters and flints, which shed light on the technology the castaways used to keep the fire alive. Subsequent investigations brought further tools and dwellings to light, and the experts were also able to determine the layout of the site. And although all these exciting discoveries at least shed some light on the historical darkness, many questions remain unanswered. For example, the scientists were unable to locate the remains of the aforementioned brackish water well. There is also no trace of the graves that the English sailors discovered in the 19th century. The archaeologists hope to find the burial sites as part of future excavations. They could provide important information about the state of health of the stranded people. To make matters worse, the testimonies of the 7 surviving women and the records of La Dauphine have been lost over time. As these important sources are missing, the experts have no choice but to rely on other information in their search for clues and use it to explore the island. However, the UNESCO-funded research project is by no means only aimed at uncovering bare facts and sober processes. It is also a way of paying tribute to the desperate struggle for survival of the slaves of Tromelin who have been forgotten for so long. Do you love learning about the most exciting and moving incidents of all time? Then what are you waiting for? Press subscribe now and never miss a video on this captivating topic again.